Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. It's faithful to the Edmonton Journal. I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Welcome, Bruce.
Hey, David. How are you doing today?
Good. Another glum, rainy day in Edmonton. I'd like to welcome all of our fantastic fans, the faithful, the wisest hockey fans in the world, Bruce. That's who listens to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, it's the diehards that keep on listening right through the dog days of monsoon season. I think that's what we should be calling it this year. Holy moly.
Yeah, the monsoon used to come in June in Alberta.
Yeah.
Here it is in July. So today, Bruce, we're going to talk about the Josh Archibald signing by the Oilers. So we actually have like a real signing to talk about. We're going to talk about the possibility, we'll end off with that, the possibility of moving Milan Lucic now that his bonus has been paid. And we'll take a little deeper dive, because that's what I've been doing this week, into Tyler Wright replacing Bob Green, and whether that's a good move or a bad move, and just how difficult it is actually to assess that kind of decision. Start with Josh Archibald. He's a 26-year-old right shot winger that the Oilers signed this year, 1 year contract, $1 million. What's your take?
My take is it's another small, safe NHL caliber bet by Ken Holland. It's another Band-Aid. It's another 1 year, $1 million class contract. In fact, exactly that amount in the case of Archibald. And they got a decent player who's going to play for the Oilers for that price. So, there's not much to criticize about Archibald. I mean, the issues the Oilers face are a little higher up the lineup, right? But Archibald last year, 68 games, 12 goals, 10 assists, 22 points. That's pretty good third-line production, especially when you line it up against the Edmonton Oilers, who only had 5 forwards who scored in double digits. Well, between Marcus Granlund and Archibald, now they're up to 7 at least. And, he killed penalties a little bit. He played a physical game, 161 hits, He's not that big of a guy, but my recollection of him is not in any kind of great detail, but of him being kind of a pain of a butt to play against.
This is a case, Bruce, I think, of the Oilers filling in for a Chiarelli move. They traded Drake Caggiula last year. I'm not as big a Drake, like a lot of people. How could you do that? Like at the time, it was pretty clear to me that Ken Hitchcock had enough of the player after a short viewing. And the reason is because Caggiula, I think, is at that time, maybe he's going to get better. He's terrible defensive NHL winger, just like honestly terrible. Poor at playing his position in the own zone, poor in the D zone, poor at winning battles, leaking goals and major scoring chances against. Now, Archibald and Caggiula over the last 2 years at even strength have had almost identical point production. So this guy seems like a great fill-in on that third line slot for Caggiula, and that's a needed fill-in because the Oilers didn't really have an obvious candidate there. Sounds like he's similar to Caggiula in a lot of ways, smaller, feisty player with a little bit of maybe a wee bit of offensive game. But I hope Archibald is a much better defensive player. And it sounds like he might be. That seems to be the kind of the verbal coming out of Arizona. He actually sounds so good at this contract amount, Bruce, that the one thing that doesn't make sense is why Arizona didn't keep him. They just had, I guess he could have taken them to arbitration.
Right.
Stauffer's been saying on Oilers now. They didn't want to do that. They are pressed up right on the cap, so they really have no wiggle room at all. So maybe that's why. Maybe it's as simple as that. Like but if he's a really good player, why didn't they keep him in Arizona? And I don't have an answer for that.
Why didn't they sign him for $1 million rather than take him to arbitration?
Well, exactly. So I don't have. Do you have any thoughts? I haven't seen them enough to say, so I can't say. But they're not. Well, I don't think they're stupid down there. They finished with more points than the Oilers, and they had who was on their team last year? Nobody.
Not McDavid.
Yeah, or Draisaitl.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they. I guess that was the concern, was that Archibald had a good enough season with enough sort of breadth to his game that he might get awarded more in arbitration than they were willing to pay, and still at a low enough level that they're not allowed to walk away. Like, I can't remember. There's some kind of threshold value where below which the team has to accept the arbitrated contract, and above which they can walk away from the guy and just let him go as a free agent. But I think Archibald's in the lower echelon of that.
Hey, Bruce, could you just check one thing? Do you know how to force quit stuff? It seems like there's a little bit of a lag in the video right now. Can you just if you can force quit as we're doing this and not actually lose this, it might speed up, like it sync our timing better on the podcast, so we're not inadvertently talking over one another. Yeah. So overall, I think pretty decent signing, and it's in line with the signings which Holland has made. He's been extremely hampered by the salary cap. He has a very little wiggle room, even with buying out Sekera. I know people are questioning that, but even with buying out Sekera, there's almost no wiggle room right now for this guy to make any moves at all. So I think this fit into that category of smart, smaller moves, and good for the GM for making it. Bruce, let's move on and talk about the Tyler Wright for Bob Green replacement, where the Oilers moved out Bob Green, who with Keith Gretzky, Bob Green's been the head scout since the McDavid draft in 2015. And so what do I've written about 8,000 words probably on this in the last week, digging into it. And the reason I dug so deeply into it is this, that looking at both Ken Holland's drop of results in Detroit, and the same thing happened with Dave Tippett, a really good coach in Dallas and then not so much in Arizona. I was kind of trying to figure out why did these two guys who had so much success then suddenly become not having much success at all? And the common denominator, Bruce, was terrible drafting in both the Phoenix organization and the Detroit organization. Not terrible in Detroit, but mediocre after 2004. They went from being the best, having one of the greatest runs of drafting in NHL history over 2 decades. I think that their record and Barry Fraser's record overall, when you combine it all together, those 2 decades for the Oilers and the Red Wings, for the Oilers during Fraser's time, and of course it was mainly concentrated at the front, but Detroit for 20 years from 1983 to 2004, fantastic, and Detroit had a great team. But what went wrong after that was poor drafting, and they didn't get enough what I call Big 12 players, Bruce. The Big 12 players, especially in a capped NHL, are critical to your success. So the top forwards on both the first and second line, also including a third line kind of Swiss Army knife player, could be a great checker, great two-way player on your third line, your top 4D and your number 1 goalie. You have to get, looking at that great run of Detroit drafting, Bruce, I ascertained that for a team to be considered a success in drafting, and this isn't as good as Detroit was there, but it's close. You got to get one Big 12 player on average every year in a draft. You have to get a Team Canada quality player, someone who's good enough to make Team Canada, even on the 4th line of Team Canada. You have to get that kind of player at least once every 4 years. You have to make excellent use of your top. If you ever have a top 10 pick, you have to make excellent use of it. That doesn't mean you have to hit every single one of them. That's not a reasonable expectation. But you got to hit about 4 out of 5 of them, or maybe 5 out of 6 of them. And finally, in your later rounds, you have to get a Big 12 player at least every second year in the draft for it to work out for you. Because not all your first round picks are going to work out. So you're going to have to get after the second round, after the first round, at least one Big 12 player every second year. And that's at least because Fraser and the Detroit Red Wings in their 2 decades runs, they were doing it almost every year, Bruce, on average, finding a Big 12 player after the first round. So that's the very, very best drafting teams. But to be a playoff team in the NHL, you don't have to be that good. And that's what I was kind of looking at, like to be a playoff team. So those were the criteria I kind of established for success or for rating a draft. What did you think of all that. So I've kind of set up the criteria here. You may agree with them or disagree with them, but what do you think of the right for green move?
Right. Well, first of all, I enjoyed your series, and I'm not sure you're probably not done yet. You still have a piece to go, or you've been vetoed?
I might look into the composition of, because it also occurred to me, like one of the reasons Detroit failed is because I think they all got complacent, including Holland, and they kept the same old scouts around. Same happened at Edmonton. That's why you keep the same old scouts around, even though they were brilliant for 5 years. They stopped being brilliant after a while because I think it's just so damn hard to do. I think it just entails so much intensity, so much hard work that people can't keep that up over decade after decade after decade. So I might look into, did Tyler Wright, in terms of turnover of that Detroit staff, how did he do in that regard? Right. And what is needed right now on the Oilers staff in terms of turnover? Right. I do think they need to move out 2 or 3 people right now and bring in 2 or 3 new ones.
So in other words, evaluate the roster not just of the players that they picked, but of the scouts that they had doing the work.
Oh, definitely, Bruce. They had terrible results for a long time. The Oilers did until recently, until Green and Gretzky. So.
Yeah. Well, I've been focusing this last while on the depth prospects in the Oilers system, and of course, one of the issues here is that there's a tremendous lag time before you can evaluate really fairly what a scout can do. And I mean, my most recent post, I talked about all the fine players who specifically went through the NC2A route that the Oilers had drafted. They had an excellent run between 96 and 2006, a little team that could era, which was the end of Barry Fraser and basically Kevin Prendergast. And that time they picked Tom Pody, Fernando Fasani, Sean Horkoff, Mike Comrie, Brad Winchester, Matt Green, Chris Vandevelde, Jeff Petrie, all in the second round or later. And they all went on to from decent to very good NHL careers. Sean Horkoff played 1,000 games, and he definitely was a Big 12 player. And you certainly say the same about Mike Comrie, Tom Pody, and Jeff Petrie. I would say all would classify as Big 12.
And I would also include Pisani, Bruce. Like, he didn't have a long run in the NHL, but he had a very...
He was a third-line driver.
Third-line player. He was of that quality to be a Big 12 player. Yeah.
He was a third-line driver, for sure.
That's meeting the test and then some for those draft years. And that's just that specific kind of player, of course. But
and then since then, especially the Stu McGregor era, and the book isn't quite closed on that for the NC2A players, but I listed a whole ton of guys, Jordan Benfeld and Kyle Bigos and Liam Coughlin, and I won't name you all the other guys because they, the names really don't mean anything. None of them made it. With only a couple of exceptions being Jujhar Khaira and Tyler Pitlick, who at least have NHL careers. And those guys actually pulled out of U.S. college and went with a different route, put them into major junior. So that whole feeder system just dried completely up for Edmonton. But the point is that even Stu McGregor, he picked William Lagesson, or his group picked William Lagesson in 2014. Yeah. 5 years later, we still have no real firm idea of what we got. And I happen to ascribe to the low tide rule of 5 years. Wait 5 years and before you evaluate. Obviously, there are exceptions. Sometimes right away on a really good or really bad pick. But a lot of these guys, and especially those college level players, 5 years is almost the norm before even they're in the pro system, let alone at the NHL level. So it's really hard to step back and say, well, Bob Green's collection of picks is a failure. I think it's much. You can certainly make a valid case. Stu McGregor's collection of picks was underwhelming. There's actually some pretty decent guys bubbling under right now, including 3 or 4 guys in the NC2A route, but it's too early to tell. But all I can tell you is that the Oilers have got almost nothing on the NHL roster from that source for a decade, and so it's tough to say. I think we can say Bob Green did a better job than Stu McGregor, and you made the case, I think, that he did a better job than Tyler Wright did in an equivalent era in Detroit. And so why the change?
Yeah, I don't think it's obvious, at least. So first of all, what you said about the difficulty of evaluating players that, is very difficult. Does take about 5 years to know.
Mhm.
The problem if you're an NHL GM is you don't have
Yeah, no,
you don't have 5 years. Like you've got to. So
well,
I
Ken
think,
Holland does.
well, maybe he does, but if you've wasted those 5 years
Yeah.
on the wrong scout, on the wrong head scout, you've screwed your franchise for the next 5 years. That's the whole problem. And that's what happened to the Oilers. We've had 2 runs. Barry Fraser, he's as good a scout as you'll find in NHL history. But he had a 5-year run between 1986 and 1990 where he didn't get one Big 12 player, Bruce, from those 5 drafts from 1986 to 1990, and not one Big 12 player. And I think that's as big, it's a huge reason why the Oilers were such a terrible team in the 90s. There's obviously other reasons, selling Gretzky and Messier and stuff, but that is another reason. So, and then the Oilers go through another, let's face it, terrible spell with Stu McGregor. And even before then, Kevin Prendergast, who was mediocre at best. And this is why they're a mediocre team. Well, this is why we have the decade of darkness, because of Prendergast and McGregor. Just terrible. They did terrible work. Like, honestly, it's just not. But the funny thing is, most of us, including me and others even more than me, were totally sold on Stu McGregor for a long time. He got the best press in Edmonton until even in 2011, 2012, people were still. He started in 2008. People are singing McGregor's praises in 2011, 2012, and this does speak to the difficulty in rating a scouting director,
also,
and accurately. So it's difficult to rate Tyler Wright and Bob Green's work in the last 5 years right now. Now you can go back with Tyler Wright though and look at his work in Columbus and in Detroit, and it's pretty, I would say, uninspiring, Bruce. There's not, like, in terms of Team Canada quality players, the only one jumping out right now is Dylan Larkin, and he'd be hard pressed to make Team Canada. And all those 7, I think it's 8 drafts, 2 in Columbus, 6 in Detroit for Tyler Wright. Only one player right now has that kind of possible quality to him. So there's other guys we don't know, how Philip Zadina, of course, and there's a lot of people who are really high on Tyler Wright's draft in 2018 for Detroit. He got Joe Velino, he got Zadina, he got it, and Ken Holland really compiled a ton of high draft picks in recent years. So it may well turn out that Tyler Wright did some really great work, but it's not really looking like that at this point. It looks like mediocre work at best, like average work at best. Now, Bob Green, it's looking like there's a chance it could be better. It looks like it's going to be at least mediocre or average work, but could be really good or even great, depending on how players like Benson, Bouchard, McLeod, Yamamoto, Samorukov, Caleb Jones, Kirill Maximov turn out. So there's a lot of players who have trended up. So I think if an NHL GM I think they have to make a decision on a scouting director after about 3 years, honestly. They can't wait that long. So it's probably hard, but you just have to look and see how players are trending in those. And if you see a scouting director isn't doing well in those first 3 years, if those players aren't the vast majority of aren't trending up, you need to fire that scouting director right now. I think, because, and the other funny thing is, Bruce, most scouts do their best work, it seems, make their best picks early in their tenure. So,
well, it's those 7 guys that you just named. I think they're all populated among our top 12 prospects for the Oilers right now. So these are guys that are closer that certainly we foresee a significant upside for, but we can't tell you conclusively about any of them. And just to go back a bit, you want to talk about how difficult it is to make to evaluate a draft. I mean, the 2010 draft, where the Oilers had 3 second-round draft picks, and they had, of course, Taylor Hall in the first round, and there was really no argument that they picked as good a player as was available in that draft. But then they had Tyler Pitlick at 31, Martin Marinson at 46, Curtis Hamilton at 48, Ryan Martindale at 61. These all, big, skilled, talented guys, and that draft projected really well, and all of those guys bombed. But
Yeah, not one Big 12 player in the bunch.
But Martin Marinson, I mean, let's just focus on him as an example. The 5-year rule applies to him. 5 years after they drafted him, he played 80 some games in the NHL for the Oilers, but they still didn't know what they had. And Peter Chiarelli, the new GM, traded him for Eric Greiba and a short-term move. And you know what? It's 4 years later now, and we still don't know what Martin Marinson is. I still wouldn't tell you 100% for sure he's not going to have an NHL career. But
I think he's having one.
Yeah, he's sort of having one for sure.
He's having. It's a very weird NHL career, that's for sure, as a tweener. But could he still, like? There's always this hope with the guy because he's 6'5" and he skates very well, and he seems to have a bit of skill that he'll be more than that. But it's in the end, he just loses too many defensive battles in his own zone to merit to be able to play higher up in the lineup. And I think that's what So you keep him around because he can get by in a third pairing role and he's cheap,
right? But anyway,
it is hard, and Bruce, Bob Green would be here today, but for two things, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure
here it comes.
He's really to blame for either of them. In fact, he is not. I don't. Okay, we'll deal with the easy one first. The Jesse Puljujärvi pick. This is similar to the Stu McGregor. He get heat for the Neal Yakupov pick, but he wanted to take Ryan Murray. The problem for Stu McGregor is that we all know he wanted to take Ryan Murray, who is not arguably a Big 12 player either. But the Oilers were gearing up to take Mikhail Sergachev, who is, I think, already a Big 12 player, and it is certainly trending that way. So in Bob Green's favor, and that was going to be the pick, but suddenly Puljujärvi fell into their lap and they took him. So that, I guess, that is on Bob Green. He could have said, no, this but apparently the Finnish GM Kekalainen in Columbus didn't want Puljujärvi because he wanted a center, not because he was necessarily negative on Puljujärvi, but that might have been part of the case as well. But so if Green had taken Sergachev or Tkachuk with that pick, he'd still be employed today by the Oilers in this chief scouting role, I think. But the other one, of course, is the Griffin Reinhardt trade. And Green was famously the face of the Oilers organization in defending that pick and in speaking enthusiastically about Reinhardt. And of course, Green had Reinhardt in junior hockey and really loved the player. It's clear. But here's what I would say about that. He didn't make that trade. He may have given Chiarelli a glowing recommendation, but it was Chiarelli who did the particulars of the trade, like giving up the first pick. That's the GM's decision. What you're going to give up for that player, that's on Chiarelli completely. Giving up the first, like maybe if it had been a second pick for Reinhardt, that's a different matter, and people aren't complaining about it today as much. But the first and second pick, the price the Oilers paid is completely on Peter Chiarelli. It is not on Bob Green at all, and I just think it's not fair or accurate to put it on Green. So, and the second thing is, Griffin Reinhardt had played a full year in the AHL. Did the Oilers not have an AHL scout that year? Who is it? Like the Eastern scout, apparently, is that Paul Messier? Was that his turf? Who was watching? And I don't know, but who was watching Griffin Reinhardt in the AHL that year? And statistically had a mediocre season. He had his point scoring hadn't increased in junior hockey. The scout that Chiarelli should have been relying on is not Bob Green, who had a year his assessment wasn't fresh. It was the AHL scout, and that's really the pro scouting of the Oilers, again failing the Oilers. That, to me, if you're going to blame a scout, you can blame Bob Green. He was front and center, but I blame the pro scouts and Chiarelli more than I blame Green, who also gets some blame.
Yeah, well, the Oilers' entire scouting core was high on Reinhardt in 2012, to the point that they were, as I understand it, legitimately talking about using the number 1 overall pick on Reinhardt. And in retrospect, I wish they had, because then rather than having Yakupov and Reinhardt as separate fiascos, it would have been just the one fiasco.
That would have been good.
Yeah. Anyway, and Bob Green wasn't with the Oilers at that time, so to tag him as a part of the old boys club, I'm not sure that was entirely fair. I mean, the Oil Kings, of course, are associated with the Oilers at arm's length kind of thing, but Bob Green did his thing and did it well with the Oil Kings. And, his history with Griffin Reinhardt went back to 2009 when he traded up at the draft, the WHL draft. He traded a number 9 all the way up to number 3 in order to pick Griffin Reinhardt. Brought him in 2010, and as soon as he arrived, the team started getting better, and they started getting way better defensively. And Reinhardt's calling card throughout his 4 years here, including 2 as captain of the Oil Kings, was a solid shutdown play. And obviously there's red flags with his skating, which either it didn't improve at the way that they expected, or maybe they just didn't get a proper read on it. Who knows? But as a shutdown player at the WHL level, I watched him go man on man against Leon Draisaitl in the 2014 playoffs and basically neutralize him. And doing the same thing against the Smurf line of Medicine Hat, and doing the same thing against all the stars of Portland Winterhawks in the finals that year. And all the earmarks said, this guy's going to be an NHL player for sure. Now the question is, is he going to be a second pairing, first pairing, third pairing? Today, I have to tell you, David, based on what I saw from his junior career, I am shocked that he's not in the NHL. And clearly he fooled a lot of other people.
Whereas I didn't mind him when he got to the Oilers. Like when I first saw him with the Oilers, I thought, oh, this guy looks like a bottom pairing NHL D man. Like even then, I thought, oh, this could work out. Like because he's big, he's smart, and in the AHL he didn't look bad. There was a real tell though with his point scoring, Bruce, in junior hockey. Yeah. If you're going to be a top 4 NHL defenseman, you're not getting a point every second game in the Western Hockey League. That's so rare that that kind of player morphs into a top 4 D man in the NHL, and that should have been another, like along with his poor performance in the AHL, which Green admitted was poor in the interview. Although he hadn't been the guy scouting him, the point scoring, and I had watched him because I had watched Reinhardt closely myself, because there had all been these rumors they're going to trade the Draisaitl pick for Reinhardt, and boy, I was shocked that they were considering that watching Reinhardt, because I did not see the skating in the offensive game as a junior player to merit that kind of enthusiasm for the player. That Oil Kings team that won the Memorial Cup is a very weird team. I don't know if one player from that entire roster is going to make it as a Big 12, or even as a marginal NHL player, Bruce. It's just a weird team where there were some good players. Samuelson was a good player, but none of those guys look like they're on track to make it as NHLers.
Well, Bob Green, he had 4 years in a row. He had a pick in, I think it was the top 4, and he took Mark Pysyk, Michael St. Croix, Griffin Reinhardt, and Curtis Lazar. And I mean, Curtis was, and they all were great junior players. Like, they were a big part of the reason that team was so successful for when they were. And Curtis Lazar, I put him in the same boat as Griffin Reinhardt to say this: I am shocked he's not in the NHL as a regular player, like whether it be bottom 6, top 6, penalty killer, he's an all-around player. And yet there was some kind of disconnect between how successful those guys were in junior hockey versus what has ultimately transpired at the NHL level. And, for the life of me, I can't really explain it.
That was a power. And the surprise is that was a powerhouse Memorial Cup team. They rolled over their opposition. They suffocated them. They were like the St. Louis Blues. That won the Cup this year. That's how they played. They just were big, tough, mean, and skilled, and they rolled over the opposition in the end. So, yeah. Anyway, so Green, if he wasn't so firmly attached to the Reinhardt trade, and he'd be, because there's not a lot of other blemishes on his record. We don't know yet about Yamamoto, of course, and we don't know about Bouchard or Broberg. So there's some picks that might not work out that we don't know about, but there's a lot that are trending in the right direction. So again, I'm not going to say they made the wrong decision in bringing in Tyler Wright. That's, you can't say that conclusively, but it's not what I have written and say. It's not obvious to me why they made this change, and that it's a good change for the organization. And make no mistake, this is a key, maybe the key hiring and management for Ken Holland, and he's got to get this right. Tyler Wright has got to get this right. So good luck to Tyler Wright. I hope he gets it right.
And to your point, I mean, Bob Green was asked for his opinion on Griffin Reinhardt by Peter Chiarelli. He was not asked, would you trade 2 high draft picks for him? Yes. As I understand it, he was just asked about Reinhardt. And any scouting director worth his salt would want to hang on to his draft picks and use them. I mean, his staff had worked all year to prepare for that draft. And then they got there, and Chiarelli traded number 16, number 33, number 57, number 79, number 86. And I mean, other than the slam dunk that had been the McDavid pick, by the time the scouts got involved again, they were way up at number 117 or something. And then they still picked a couple pretty good players in Caleb Jones and Ethan Bear. Like, they salvaged a not bad draft, but most of the picks got traded away for short-term fixes. And the impression I got was Chiarelli sort of said, well, he put a package together to offer for Dougie Hamilton, and when it didn't work, he thought, well, here's my package. I'm going to go and get a more developed defenseman. And the theory is not totally bad, but the execution obviously left a lot wanting. But my friend Lowtide, we had a chat about this yesterday on the radio, and he made a similar point about, and he used a baseball example, as he often does, and talked about a scout of the New York Mets being asked about Jim Fregosi as a player and giving a sort of a lukewarm recommendation for Fregosi, but not being told that the package to acquire him would include the future great Nolan Ryan and 3 other guys. And the scout was absolutely floored when he found out what the Mets had given up for him, when all he'd been asked for is, what do you think, should we get Fregosi? So ultimately, the GM owns it. And the GM owns it, good or bad. Like, I've also heard over the years, Chiarelli haters saying, well, the Talbot trade worked out, but that wasn't really Chiarelli. That was a gift from Sather, or that was set up by McTavish before he left, and all Chiarelli had to do was say yes or whatever. Well, it wasn't a done deal until day 2 of the draft, and he got the deal done, and that goes on Chiarelli's record, as does the Reinhardt trade, as does Marinson for Greiba, and every other move that he made. It's it's the GM's. The buck stops there.
Indeed. So Bruce, let's finish off with Milan Lucic. So apparently, there's some debate about this, but
in
apparently,
your dreams.
Yeah. Well, I wrote what you properly ascertained as a somewhat whimsical post. Some people take it at face value. The post I wrote, it was the top 10 reasons that another team might want to acquire Milan Lucic. So I was trying to put the best possible arguments that, like, if I was Ken Holland, these are the lines that I was trying to feed Ken Holland his lines essentially, and that you would use if you wanted to trade Milan Lucic. Now, the reason, like, there's been plenty of smoke about the Lucic thing. There might be fire. There might be some fire, although I doubt it. But there might be some fire in this next week, because apparently this is his $3 million bonus has been paid now for this season. So that's that. A team doesn't have to pay that. Would that also go against the Oilers cap then, and not against the team's cap that has acquired him? Do you know?
No, it's part of the way I understand it is that the team that would acquire him would get the whole cap.
That was what I thought.
Even if the other team had paid the actual check, so they would
that's right. That's
4 years. 4 years at $6 million, and they would only have to pay him $16 million out of the seemingly 24 that's owed to him. So there's a substantial cash savings relative to the contract. But even 4 years at 16 is awfully steep for where that player is now.
So Bruce, a lot of the reasons I gave, look, the reason you trade him, and I don't hate Lucic on the fourth line. I think he's maybe a decent to good fourth line NHL player right now, especially. But the reason the Oilers, I think, would really want to trade him is because they are well stocked with tough guys, and another NHL team might have a real need for a tough guy. Like, if you have some young star like Johnny Gaudreau or what's the Peterson,
Elias
Pettersson in Vancouver, and on, that's getting banged up, and you want to protect that player, you might want a player like Milan Lucic if you don't have that player already. So I see this as a classic situation where he has more value to another team than he does to the Oilers, who are well stocked with Zach Kassian, Kara, Darnell Nurse, all these tough guys already. They don't need that kind of guy. Another team might. So most of the reasons revolve around that, and the fact that Lucic still fulfills that role. The interesting thing to me, and I saw a tweet, and I wasn't aware of this because I don't really engage in Corsi analysis, but
he's always had good possession stats.
He's always had good possession stats. Bruce, Milan Lucic had a better Corsi number at even strength last year on the Oilers than Connor McDavid. Now, to me, I don't buy Corsi numbers. That's Exhibit A, why I don't buy them. But a lot of NHL teams do. Like, this is the fact of the matter. They've hired all kinds of people who come out of the Corsi school of thought. You'd think and I don't know if this is true. Like maybe they just look at Milan Lucic, these Corsi guys, and say, no, 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 no. And that's the way a lot of the Edmonton Oilers fans who really rely on Corsi analysis look at it. But if you really do believe in those numbers, I mean, you're looking at someone who had essentially the same Corsi relative as McDavid and a better Corsi number than McDavid. Now against slightly weaker competition, But that in classic Corsi analysis, you'd say this could be an undervalued player. Plus, his shooting percentage was low, and I actually do think Lucic has had some bad puck luck. So there's a couple things that analytically inclined people from a certain school might look at this player and say, "Well, this guy isn't as bad as people say."
Right.
Do you think that's fair?
Well, I mean, to me, a lot of those 10 points that you raised, all of them had, or most of them at least, had some degree of validity. I think there's maybe a couple of whimsical comments in there, but they had some degree of validity. Of course, the elephant in the room is that contract. And
Indeed.
that's what brings that player down. I mean, if Oilers had Milan Lucic under contract for $1 or 1.5 or even $2 million, you wouldn't be getting anywhere near this kind of stuff. And I mean, I agree that he still has a NHL life as a bottom six player. I won't say fourth liner, but I will say bottom six. And $6 million for a bottom six is just cruel. And unfortunately, it's crushed the Oilers' budget for acquiring wings. Their wing budget goes to firstly Milan Lucic and secondly to Sam Gagner, and then dribs and drabs after that. But I don't hate the player. I've long sort of, like, he's not my favorite player, and he wasn't when he was with Boston or anything. But I long sort of admired him and said, that kind of player really has value. But the cliff that he's fallen off in the last year and a half, I mean, you could tell that kind of player type would slow down at some point over the 7-year contract, but there was no anticipating that he would go a year and a half at sort of his normal production rates and then just completely lose his scoring touch and other elements of his game as well, like his puck handling, and just his hands have deserted him to my eye, and that's what's going to make him a tough sell.
Yeah. So I'm okay with him on the fourth line. What I'm worried about is he'd be bumped up to the second line again. I mean, Stauffer's already talking about him as a second line. We are penciled in with Nugent Hopkins right now. I mean, we had him last year penciled in with Draisaitl, and my worry is that's what's going to happen, and we're going to waste more time. It's going to take Tippett 20, 30 games. Fortunately, Tippett, unlike Dallas Aikens, is actually going over video right now of Oilers games, I hear. So he will see with his own eyes, his own astute NHL coach eyes, exactly Milan Lucic's level of performance. And Bruce, what we found with our own statistical analysis, like going over videotape and looking at scoring chances, is that, Corsi had him as the top player, regular player who played more than 40 games, top forward. We had him as the worst as for a forward. And that's where what I see from Lucic is he's the worst two-way hockey player at forward on the Oilers right now. And I'm hoping he does get traded. So, and I didn't put that in the article because I was trying to persuade people that they should acquire him in a trade. So, although I don't know how persuasive my own statistical analysis would be to other GMs, I doubt it would have any impact at all. But I think there's a chance. I'm saying there's a chance, Bruce, that he will be moved. What do you say?
Well,
for a bad contract.
Yeah, the issue with I mean, you talk about the Corsi analysis, and that's, that's what's long been referred to as an underlying number, but it's only part of a much larger stream now of underlying numbers, of which our scoring chances, I would argue, is one such. Certainly things like expected goals, dangerous Fenwick that the boys at Puck IQ have been putting out, and those stats certainly moderate what you might take from Corsi alone. Like, is his expected
goals not as good?
It's not as good, and I haven't got the right page.
Well, that's a better stat than Corsi then.
Yes, Yeah, there are a number of stats that are better than
Yeah, I
Corsi.
looked at his Sven. Like his Sven kind of
Corsi's
matches up with his Corsi. It's not that
Corsi's
different.
more zone time than it is real creation of or allowance of dangerous chances. Some of the issues I have with Milan Lucic's game are inside his own blue line.
Oh, mostly.
Yeah.
Mostly.
So,
He's like Caggiula, like he was leaking chances against. And that's, to me, that if anything's turning me against Lucic, it's his own zone defensive play, Bruce. Like, it's just not acceptable. He's got to get better at it, and he's got to focus more. And I think he seems like a smart man. He should be able to do that if he bears down on it. He should make it his number one priority, Lucic, his own zone play, and taking care of things in his own zone. So if he's
when that puck comes to you 5 feet inside the blue line, around the boards with a defenseman on you, it's got to get over the line, and it's got to get over the line consistently. And that's a part of his game that he's had some significant issues with.
And the other part is when you're back checking, get back as hard as you can, as fast as you can, and take someone. Take the right guy. Don't puck watch. Don't be in that red light zone where you're not taking anyone and you're not covering a passing lane. Get on someone and cover that passing lane. Like, that was a huge issue with him and Caggiula last year, and he's got to get better at it. And it's not mentioned, right? Like, because I mean, we do this analysis, we see this repeatedly, leading to grade A scoring chances against. Maybe other people don't. I mean, we've time-stamped all of those mistakes. They're there for the looking at. If you want to go over the video, it's there to see. All right. Anything else to add, Bruce? What do you think? Did you say? Do you think he's going to be moved? Yes, Bruce. Yes or no? Will he be moved this summer?
Probably not, because I mean the contract is such an albatross. If he is, we'll have some other albatross in its place. And I mean, the question isn't just you get rid of the player and the problem is solved. The question is, well, what do you take on in return? And if you take on another $6 million unproductive player like Louis Eriksson, like many have pointed out, well, your improvement is marginal at best. So, I mean, they're saddled with a contract, whether it's that contract or one very similar to it. It's going to create some kind of financial penalty to get out from under it, and possibly assets as well to move it. So
there's one benefit, though.
Rock in a hard place.
There's one benefit of moving for a equally weak player. And that's that you get out from under Lucic's no movement contract, which can impact you in the expansion draft. And you do it sooner than later. You have more chances to do it down the road, but you do it now. And that's the so in doing anything, you're just shuffling the box. And in the shuffling, you're making your team better a little bit, just because you got one bad thing out of the way, dealt with. You checked it off the list of things to do. And so I'm not a fan of the Eriksson idea of trading him for that player, although except for that, you get rid of that no movement clause, and you also there's 1 year less on Eriksson's deal. I think Lucic is a more valuable player. Like, I think if Lucic on the open market would get between $2 and $3 million a year right now on a 1-year deal, I don't think Eriksson would be lucky to get a contract. And so I think, like, honestly, he's had 3 years in a row of around 10 goals. He might get a 1-year deal at $1 million. That's as much as I could see him getting. So James Neal, on the other hand, if he was on the open market, what would he get? Like, that's the other player I mentioned. I think James Neal would get on the open market. He'd probably get a 1-year deal at about $3 million, or maybe 2.5. What do you think?
Yeah.
Maybe maybe not. Maybe that was a pretty bad year, but I think Neal has more value than Eriksson, put it that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. He's had 10, 20 goal seasons in a row, and then last year he just didn't find his place in Calgary, and I think they got impatient real fast, and he wound up kind of an afterthought, and also other guys were working out for them, so it was hard for him to get a toe in the door after the bad start.
That was like kind of a toxic, like, it sounds like the verbal around it sounds kind of really negative with Neal in Calgary, which makes me think that there might be a trade there, like more poisonous than, say, Lucic in Edmonton, which it sounds like his teammates really like Lucic, and I'm not getting that vibe out of Calgary necessarily. I'm not. It just sounds a little weird, and I can't say anything other than that. Like, it seems to be something going on. Bruce, I know you need to get going here, so why don't we call it call it a day. Thanks for talking
Sure.
today.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.